Hello dear friends, peace be with you. Someone once said, it is not parents' responsibility to have godly children, but it is parents' responsibility to make sure that their children have godly parents. Having grown in a troubled home, I am well aware of the impact that parents can have on their children's life. I always wonder how my life would have turned out if I had parents who lived a God-centered life and brought me up in a God-fearing way. But I just cannot blame them because they themselves did not have godly parents. It is just a vicious cycle. Generation after generation, children are lost to the ways of the world because of ungodly parents. But thanks to the providence of God, I was able to break that vicious cycle in my family. Up and down the centuries, Catholic parents have done their best to give their children good education, good social environment, good quality of life, but the responsibility of imparting the faith, they have always left it to the church and the clergy. But Saint Pope John Paul II says that parents are the first educators of their children. Not the school, not the church, not the universities, but the parents. But do Catholic parents realize this great responsibility bestowed on them? Even if they do, what can Catholic parents do to renew their faith, catechize themselves, and in turn impart the same to their children? Well, it is a very difficult and a complicated question to answer. But I found someone who can. Few months back, I stumbled upon a blog article in the Word on Fire website. There I found a wonderfully written article on Catholic parenting. The author of that article was Ricky Jones from the United States of America. Ricky is married to his wonderful wife Joanna, and they together have 3 wonderful children. In this interview, Ricky shares his perspective on some very tough questions on parenting with Catholic flavor. This video could quite be the turning point in your life as parents. So please join me and Ricky for this wonderful interview. God bless you. So Ricky, we will start by you giving a brief introduction to your family, your upbringing, and also your wife and your children.
Okay.
We can start, Ricky. Could you introduce them?
Yeah. So right now I'm married. I've been married almost 7 years. I'll be 7 years next month, or 8 years next month. 7 years now. We've got two boys, 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, and we just found out that we have another one on the way. So that's pretty exciting news. We're hoping for a girl this time. But I grew up in a small family. It was just me and my younger brother from a different father and my mom. So we grew up in a small family. There was no really lived example of faith. My mom didn't go to church. My dad didn't go to church. I'm a child of divorce, so my parents were divorced before my first birthday. So I didn't really ever have a strong, idea of what it means to walk with God or to, have any relationship with God. That was just non-existent. That's how I grew up. I was not really an atheist, but definitely an agnostic. I didn't really know what to believe, didn't really care. And it wasn't until I met my wife that I started to get to understand what this whole God thing was all about. And so I met her, and her family was Catholic at the time. And so we would go to Mass on Sundays, and I wanted to make a good impression, right? And so I would go with them on Sundays, and it worked because she married me. But one of the first things she told me was, if you want to be with me, we're going to have to get married in the church, and you're going to have to be a Catholic. And at that time, what are you talking about? I wasn't even thinking of marriage or any of that. But it's funny how God works. And I think eventually, there was one instance where she had to work on a Sunday, and I decided of my own, will, I'm going to go to Mass anyways. And so I ended up going to Mass by myself. And it was a Spanish Mass. At that time, I wasn't fluent in Spanish. So I'm sitting there alone in the pew, people all around me, have no idea really what's going on, what's being said. At that moment, I have this encounter, and I realize in my heart that God is real. And that's where it all began for me. I began the whole process of RCIA and everything, and ended up coming into the church in 2008. So coming up on my 10-year anniversary. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, I mean, it's for me, I think it was making that decision, because God has always been pursuing me. Not like looking back, I can see the instances in my life where He sent people to try to talk to me, or where He's put people in my life to try to show me, hey, I'm here. And I think it took until I met her and her family to really decide for myself. I want to say yes to you, God, and that's really all I did. I didn't have an emotional experience. I didn't have any mystical vision or anything like that. But I just knew in my heart, I had that realization, God is real, and so I wanted to know more, and that's where it began for me. Um, that's when I came into the church.
Yeah, and the Catholic teaching clearly says, Ricky, that it is God who comes in search of us. It's not the other way. That He's the one who first loved us. So I think you would give a lot of credit to the providence of God in your life.
Oh, definitely, yes, because I was definitely not looking for Him at that time.
Yeah, and also once you did RCIA and then you came into the Catholic Church, which aspect of the sacramental life of the church attracted you the most?
It's interesting because when I first came into the church, I remember when I did my baptism, my first communion, my confirmation, all in one day, and then we had a party because it was close to my birthday, so we had a party. And my wife is Mexican, and they'll make any excuse to have a party, and so we had this big party. And one of the things I remember is I I always look to the example of Saint Peter, because he was a horrible, a horrible disciple. Everything that God would tell him or Jesus would tell him, and he never understood, and he was always messing up and making mistakes. Jesus even says, you're going to deny me 3 times. He's like, oh no, that's not going to happen. That was definitely me. And so I think when I first came into the church, I consider myself like an infant at this time, right? I have no idea. I'm still trying to figure out how to do this. And so I came into the church, and I remember specifically after being baptized, you read the accounts of, Jesus' baptism, and the heavens open, and the Holy Spirit descending like a dove, and a voice proclaiming, "You are my beloved Son." And at my baptism, I was like, I don't hear any voice. I don't see any doves coming down. So I still was trying to grasp all of that. And so after my baptism, we had this party, and there was still drinking and stuff like that. I see, just like how Simon Peter, it was a lifelong process of conversion. And for me, I know even that day, I had no idea what was going on still. It took, a while for me to start to look back and see that grace that I received from the sacraments starting to work in my life and change those things. And so I think that's the powerful witness for me, to know that, hey, the sacramental life is real. God touches you through the sacraments. I learned that by watching how it happened, by seeing the grace come into my life, and all of a sudden start to see things change. And I'm not going to live this way anymore. I'm going to live this way because I feel a calling to do. There's so many different things that started to change in my life. And I know it wasn't because I just woke up one day and said, hey, I'm not going to do this anymore, right? I really felt God calling me and equipping me to be able to do it, because it was crazy. Like, there's some things that I had to change in my life. And for a lot of people, they'll struggle with that. But for me, it was like from one day to the next, as soon as I felt God say, I don't want you to do this anymore, I stopped. I started living a different way, and I never looked back. And it was definitely grace, because I know it wouldn't have been something I would have been able to give up on my own, with the alcohol and all of those things.
And did the sacraments, living the sacramental life of the church, strengthen your spousal relationship after marriage?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, because one of those things that I was just mentioning that I struggled with was pornography. And so before we got married, that was something that I was all into. And my wife found out, we had a conversation about it. And it was during that process of our engagement, we had like the 6 months, leading up to our wedding. And we had that conversation, and I said, okay, you know what? I'm not going to do this anymore. And again, I never struggled after that with it at all. It wasn't like, oh man, it was like an addiction for me. And the same with alcohol and all of those things. But not for some reason, obviously God, afterwards, it was not a struggle at all to just say, you know what, I'm done. And I never had a temptation at all to look back or to go back and start doing those things again. So I definitely was able to see how her being there with me together in preparation for the sacrament of holy matrimony definitely strengthened our relationship, but also how we battle these different issues that we have.
So you were talking about pornography, how the practice of the sacraments helped you come out of that addiction. So same has been in my case. There are a lot of times when we struggle with our own strength to come out of these addictions, but then you keep going back to it. But once you live the sacraments of the church with its full power and grace, then it becomes very easy for you to overcome struggle. So it has been my experience also, Ricky.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now going into the interview, Ricky, parenting is one of the most important topic that everybody wants to discuss, and everybody has different opinions on that. So before we discuss on the different aspects, I just want you to kind of set the context for the interview. We are all created in the image of God. And as you wrote in your blog, you said parents are the first image of God for the children.
Right.
So, if you could explain why it is so important for God to play a role when it comes to parenting.
Well, I think that whole idea of the parents being an image of God to their children, that really hit me once I became a father, because this whole idea of calling God Father, that was hard for me, because when I was getting into this faith, when I was growing up, I never had a father who was there to kind of show me all of those things, to show me this is what it means to be a father. So I remember when I became a father, I realized, wow, this is a big responsibility. This is a lot of work involved here, and I never had a father. Growing up in a household just with a mother, so it was kind of difficult for me when I first started reading the Bible to look at why would God reveal himself to us as Father. And so I think after I became a father, I really started to see God in a whole new way. So for me, the first year of being a parent was mind-blowing for me, because not just because of obviously having a child and all that comes with that, but just being able to see God in a different light, because I was able to see him as a father, whereas before it was hard for me to really understand or even grasp that whole idea of our Father who art in heaven. And so I think that was a big step for me in understanding that whole idea of the fatherhood of God. But yeah, I think us as parents have a huge responsibility to show our kids God, right? It's easy to tell them about God, say, here, read the Bible and do all these things, but if we don't show them with our example, it's very likely that they're just gonna look at it as any other subject that they could learn in school, right? So I think for me as a parent, especially as a father, they look at me as if I'm God in a way, and that's helps. So my example is going to help form the image of God that they're going to have later in life. And so it's very important for us to be able to show God's love, God's mercy, God's tenderness, especially at a young age. Like my kids are still really little, and I know that right now the most important thing that I can teach them is love, to show them that they are loved by me and by God.
So, Ricky, as you might know, there are so many discussions, so many institutions which discuss about this topic of parenting, and parenting differs in its aspect based on the culture, based on the religious belief. So, what is unique to the Catholic way of parenting?
Oh, so many things. I think everything about looking at it from a Catholic perspective is completely different than what all the books that you'll read, about parenting. And I think first and foremost is the goal. Like, what is parenting about? Like, what is the reason that we are parents? And I think in the world, a lot of times our focus is on education, which is a good thing. It's on success, especially financially. So our goal as parents in the world is to make sure our kids are really super smart, they can get a really good job, they can make a lot of money, and they can be successful, and then they'll have a good life, right? That's our goal in the world. But I think from a Catholic perspective, those things are still important. It's still important to have a good education, all of those things. But our primary goal from the Catholic perspective is heaven, right? So if our goal as Catholic parents is to get our children to heaven, is to show them God, like I was saying earlier, so that we can help lead them throughout the course of their life, lead them to heaven, lead them to an eternal relationship with God. And I think having that perspective changes the way you do everything, right? It's a whole different approach to parenting.
And this is one of the controversial questions that people generally want to know the answer to. In America especially, a lot of Christian families come to this conclusion that we cannot force the religion on your children. What's your take on that?
Oh wow, me and my wife have talked about this a lot because it's true. We taught catechism for 5 years, and the parents would come, and it's something that I think, like you said, it's really permeated the culture, whereas you can't force them to do anything. But my wife explains it beautifully because she says, you don't ask your kid if they want to eat, right? You give them food and you say it's time to eat, because if they don't eat, they're going to get sick, they're going to die, they need to eat. Well, even more than that, they need to have a relationship with God. They need to know God, because we know that God is the source of all of our life, right? Our eternal salvation depends on their relationship with God. Why would you want to say, oh, well, let's just wait until maybe they'll decide when they're older if they want to do it, right? Well, you wouldn't say, oh, well, I'm not going to feed him, I'll wait until he's older and he can make that decision for himself. You have to feed him. Say, you know what, son, it's time to eat. Let's come sit down as a family. We're going to eat. It's a natural part of life. So why would we have friends and family who are, for example, Protestant, and so for them, baptism is something that you have to choose for yourself. And I see the merit in that because I was one of those people who was able, as an adult, to say I want to be baptized. So I see the value in that. But it's like, if I know what I've gained from my baptism as an adult, why would I want to hold off that from my kid until they've, already grown up, or until they've had to go through all kinds of stuff without grace, right? Because the grace is what helps them to get through the struggles. He's like, no, I'm going to let them struggle on their own, knowing that they'll never be able to overcome any of these problems until they're able to make that decision for themselves. I think that's ridiculous. I think the most important thing we can do for our children, is, even at a young age, even if they don't understand everything that's going on, is to bring God into the picture. Because without that, it's just silly. I think it's impossible to think that they're going to live a good life without the only one who is good, which is God.
And this is another question which I wanted to ask. It's very important that parents are role models to their children, because children learn from what they see than from what they hear. So I feel it's very important for parents to kind of practice what they preach, which could be the golden rule for parenting. For
Right.
them to be that kind of a role model, what do you think is very essential for parents to do?
I think the faith of the parents is very important, because whether we're talking about, catechesis or teaching the kids about God and all of that, in any aspect of life, it's like you can't tell the kids, oh, don't do this, sonny, and then they see you over here doing that, right? And it's something where, like you said, it's not just what we tell them. A lot of times we tell them, oh, don't do this, don't do that, or do this, do that, but that's not what they're not absorbing that. What they really learn, like you said, is the example, the way we live our lives. That's what they're going to follow. So even if we tell them all this wonderful stuff, oh, God is great, and these are the 10 Commandments, that's great. But if they see us over here living a different lifestyle, they're going to follow the example. They're not going to follow all the stuff that we told them. And that became really clear for us when we started teaching catechism, because the parents, what we did is we taught family catechism, and we had a different approach to it than the traditional approach of, okay, I'm going to take my kids and drop them off at church. The catechist will teach them, then I'll pick them up and take them home. Because what we saw with that was that the kids would come and they would learn great stuff, the good news, it's wonderful. But then they go home to their family who's living a totally opposite lifestyle. Well, that kid is going to be confused. They're going to, the pull is going to be much stronger for them to just follow the example of their parents, which is not a good one in this case, instead of all that they learned at church. So what we did with family catechism is we would say, leave the kids at home and the parents come into the class, and we would teach them in the faith. And so what happened is, not only are the parents having to go home and teach their kids with words and books and things like that, but the kids would see the change in their parents, in the way they would live their lives, in the way they would approach different things, and that was a much more powerful teacher to them. I think it was Pope Paul VI said, parents are people listen more strongly. Yes, that, and then he also said people listen more to witnesses than to teachers. If they listen to teachers, then it's because they are witnesses. And I think that applies to parenthood as well. It's only if we give that example and tell them this is the way that we're able to do it. And it's like, look at Jesus, right? Like there was all the teachers of the law and the Pharisees and all, they were the ones out there teaching this stuff, but they weren't living it. And so that's where the struggle was. But Jesus comes and he says, God loves you. And he doesn't just say God loves you. He shows you by the example of his life, God loves you. And I think that's the perfect example to follow, is look at the way Jesus taught people. That's the way we have to do it as parents.
I think Pope John Paul II said that they are teachers because they are parents. It's a kind of a grace which is bestowed upon them. Another important question, Ricky, I really want to know your take on this. A lot of times children hear so much from the culture, from their friends, from their relatives, and finally they come back to their parents to kind of validate and especially validate those things, and especially when it comes to questions of morality. So my question is, today, the state of Catholic faithful, they are very poorly catechized, and, they do not hold to the teachings of the church in many areas where they find it difficult. So when it is like that, do you think it's very important that parents do not compromise the church teaching, especially when it comes to, the questions of morality?
Yeah, and I think it applies, again, to the parents first and then to the children, because it's like, if you're going to say, for example, if I as a parent am gonna say, okay, I'm Catholic, but I can't make it to mass this week, right? We're gonna go on a camping trip or something. Okay, it might not sound like a huge deal, right? Oh, it's just 1 week, I can go again next week. It's not the end of the world. And that was a question that comes up, right? Because the kids are gonna ask you, oh, well, why do we have to go to church every week? My kids, they're already, he's 4 years old and he's already like, Daddy, I don't want to go to church. Okay, but if we do that, then are we showing that this is something essential for our lives? Just like we say, oh, I'm not going to eat today. I'm not, I don't need to eat today. I'll eat tomorrow. Okay, but if I don't eat today, then I'm going to be tired. I'm not going to have the energy I need to get through the day. Well, the same is true with, for example, going to mass, right? That's giving me the strength I need for the rest of the day or for the rest of the week, because Jesus is the source and summit of our faith. He is the nutrient, not the nutrient, the sustenance that we need to get through the day. And so I think if we're saying, oh, well, I'll make it to mass next week, I can't go this week. Well, it might seem trivial, but one, we're not giving the example to the kids of how important this is, and we're kind of showing that, hey, it's not that important. I don't really need it. It's just something that we say is important. Oh yeah, it's a good idea. We probably should go, but maybe this is more important. And you start little, by saying, oh, it's just 1 week. Well, then what happens next week? Yeah, I'm not going to go next week either. And then the week after that, I guess we don't really need to go to church. I can still have a relationship with God here. And so that's where you really start to get off track and you have all kinds of issues. So I think it's showing by the example of your life that these are the things that are important. This is the way we are to live.
And especially when it comes to the question of obedience, all the parents want their children to obey to everything that they say. And there is, from my experience, I've realized, Ricky, is that when you do not obey to an authority, you cannot expect anybody below you to obey you. And I think it applies very much when it comes to parenting. And for all Catholics, the church and its teaching is the authority that we obey to. So when we kind of compromise on that, I think, we cannot seek the kind of obedience that we expect from our children. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And going back to Family Catechism, when we used to teach, the funny thing is we expect that as parents we're going to teach our kids, but a lot of times it's the kids that have to teach the parents. And I think the example that we would see time and time again in catechism was that the parents were going through this whole process of catechism for their kids to be able to receive First Communion, right? And a lot of times they do it, okay, it's the tradition, this is what we do, we're Catholic, so, when you're 7 years old, it's time to do catechism. But as they would go through the program, they would realize, and they would share a lot, that the kids would ask them at Mass on Sunday, oh, Mom, Dad, why do I have to go up to the front for communion if you guys don't go? And the parents kind of look at each other like, oh, and it's true, you're saying that this is so important, that this is a big part of your life, yet you're not doing it because you're living in sin and you're not able to receive communion. And so for the kids who are 7, 8 years old to point that out to the parents feel really, really silly at that moment, because they're like, well, I guess it is something that we need to do. And a lot of times that's what it took for them to start making those changes in their lives to be able to receive communion again. So a lot of these couples were just living together, but they weren't married in the church. And it's like, okay, well, what are you waiting for? You've got 5 kids, you've been together for 15 years. Why not take that step, right? Why not get the grace that you need to live out this sacrament? And so I think that speaks to what you're saying about, we have to show them how to live, the best way to live.
Yeah, and Bishop Fulton Sheen said it gets three to be married, and it's very important that the husband and wife have a good relationship when they want to have their children kind of imbibe the love that they share between each other. So how much do you think a good spousal relationship when it comes to parenting?
Well, like you said, it's the children are an extension of that love, right? So I think in order for us to give the best family environment to the kids, we got to make sure that is our relationship strong. Is God the center of our life? Then you're bringing those kids into the best environment you could ever have. There are studies that say, the best thing to make sure of the success of the kids is, to finish school, high school, to not have kids before you get married, and to stay together as a 2-parent household, and that those things will ensure the future of those children. And it sounds so simple. I remember growing up, they would say first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby in the baby carriage. And that makes sense. It's simple. But if you look at our culture, we don't live it that way anymore, right? People are having kids before they get married, or they're with people that they don't even really love each other, but they feel like, oh, well, this is the best I can do, so I'm just going to settle with this guy. And so I see that happen so many times, so many women who kind of just have settled with whatever they can get, when they could do so much better. They could actually find a man who loves them, is willing to sacrifice for them, who's willing to be, to help lead them to heaven, which is the point of marriage. But yet they've got themselves into this situation where, they've already got kids with this guy. And so it's just sad that, things that in the past were so clear and so, simple, we've still got off track, and it's just like, man, it's tough.
Yeah. So before we go on to the challenges of parenting, Ricky, I just want to touch upon this last point where you also wrote in your blog that, marriage is where a man and a woman sanctify each other, where they carry their cross. So if you could explain that a little more.
Yeah, definitely carrying the crosses, I think, is a perfect example, because a lot of times we look at some of the sayings that Jesus has. He's like, if you want to follow me, you must deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me. Okay. Or, we think that to be a good disciple, to be a good Christian, he says, leave everything behind and come and follow me. That means, I'm going to leave my wife, I'm going to leave my kids, and I'm just going to go be a monk or something. Well, the way Jesus calls us isn't to just, stop, having a family or any of those things, but he's saying that we need to, if we put all our trust in him, if we're focused, centered our lives completely around him, that's going to affect all those aspects of our lives. It's going to affect our relationship with our spouse. It's going to affect our relationship with our kids. And so I think for us as spouses, as parents, when we're able to take what we learn from Jesus, what he's challenging us to do, and apply it in the household, in the family, because that's where it has to start first. And a lot of times we think like the example I would always give is like the works of mercy, right? We always think we have to, the first thing you think of is, I have to go out and find some homeless people and help them. It's like, well, yes, that's a good thing to do, and they need help. Let's help them, you know? For example, my family, once a month, we make 30 sandwiches for the parish that they hand out to homeless people. Because every day at our parish, there's lunches that the homeless can come and eat. And so we signed up for one day of the month to do that. And that's great. But that's just one thing. I think even before you start doing all of that, you got to be living this stuff out in your home. You know, we think about, again, the works of mercy: feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick. Well, as a parent, those are all things that you do to your children, right? You feed them, you clothe them, you give them drink, you take care of them when they're sick. And I remember one of the students in my catechism class talked about that one year, and that blew my mind because I think my wife was pregnant at the time, so we didn't even have kids yet. So I didn't understand, I didn't grasp that, because I always thought, oh, you know, living the faith and being a good Christian is about all that stuff that you do out here in the world to help poor people and homeless people. But then I started to think about it after she said that, and like, wow, you know, that's true. All of that can be lived out in the home, in the family, not just immediate family, but extended family, and then from there it extends to the rest of the world, right? But I think it starts in the home, and if you can't live it there, then it doesn't matter. Because a lot of times we go to church and we're involved in these groups and ministries, and we're so holy and we do all this good stuff, but then in the home we're completely different people. And I've heard people tell stories where the kids, I don't remember where I heard it, but the kid was basically saying a prayer that, you know, God, make mommy as nice as she is to the people at church here to us. It's like breaking the heart of the parents, you know. And it's true. It's like, why are we, you know, different? We put on this different face to the world, but then at home we're still these horrible people. Well, that's not really showing the witness of how God has changed our lives. And so I think it starts in the home.
Yeah. Okay. Very good, Ricky. So now, you know, I got you know, few questions when I had posted about your interview. So these are the questions that, you know, audiences wanted me to ask you. So I have prioritized the challenges. You know, I want your opinion on that. So the first thing is, you know, all of us have these inner wounds, the weaknesses, you know, that we carry forward in our life, and due to these weaknesses, sometimes, you know, parents give in to certain actions which are not morally right, or, you know, morally right. And, you know, those times they really feel bad that they have been a wrong example to their children. So what would you tell for parents who have still struggling with that weakness? What would you advise them to do?
So when you say weakness, you mean their weakness of not being able to stand up for the truth and be strong on whatever that issue is? Oh, okay. I think when you mentioned give in, I always have this, you know, I think there's a difference between giving up and giving in. And I remember I wrote an article on that one time that, you know, it's when you think of give up, it's like, okay, I can't do this, right? But when you think of give in, I think of giving in to God. So I think in those examples, it's like, being a Christian is not easy, right? And a lot of times we have that misconception. People are like, oh, well, if I just come to Jesus, then life is going to be easy and I'm not going to have problems. And it's like, you know, we had a friend who we were her sponsors for confirmation, and she came into the church and she started to see it's not as easy as you think. She was like, why didn't you guys tell me it was going to be this hard? And it's like, you know, did you really think it was going to be that easy? Like, look at the things that Jesus says. You know, they're going to persecute you. You know, it's not easy to be a Christian, especially nowadays. You're living a countercultural lifestyle, right? So it's like that example of the salmon swimming upstream. It's not easy, but God gives us the strength to do it. And I think that applies to this too. You know, if whatever the issue is, you know, say it's you know, homosexuality is a big issue right now. You know, we have friends who their kids don't want to go to church because they say, well, why does God doesn't love gay people, right? Well, that's not the teaching of the church, right? And if the parents are able to understand, you know, it's not that God doesn't love gay people. God has a way for us. He knows what's best for us. He's saying that this is the way that we are to live. If you're over here trying to go this way, God's going to tell you, no, you need to come back over here, right? And I think that's the same with the parents. But if we're not turning to God again for our strength to be able to stand up, because sometimes those are issues are hard to stand up for, because everything else in the world is saying that this is wonderful, this is great, this is the best way to live. Well, as a Catholic parent, sometimes you got to be able to say, you know what? I know everybody else is doing this. I know on TV it looks like this is an okay lifestyle, but this is what we believe. This is what God has told us. We believe more the vision of God than the vision of man, right? And it's tough sometimes, but I think just being able to stand up to it, like you said, is a powerful teaching for your children, because they're going to say, wow, my parents are able to not to give in to, or give up or give in to what the culture is saying. Their faith is strong enough to say that, if this is what God says, I'm going to follow him, even with all that pressure. And that's one of the things that I've seen, and one of the reasons that I know that the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus founded, because if you look at, in these 2,000 years, how many attacks, how much pressure they've had from the culture to say, oh, well, let's just change the teaching so we don't have to be arguing and fighting with these people. No, the fact that the church has said this is truth, objective truth that cannot be changed. We don't say one day that this is right and this is wrong, and then the next day, oh, actually, just the fact that the church has stood up for truth, the church hasn't backed down. To me, that's a big reminder of what Jesus said. He's like, the gates of hell will not prevail against you. And I think that as parents, to be able to stand up for those things, even when it makes you unpopular, even when you lose friends, I think that's an example to them of how they have to live their faith too, live their life in general, to not back down from something like that is the truth. Because, and I think the best way is to share the truth in love, right? So charity and truth. It's like you've got to stand up for the truth, but to do it also that's with love, and to show, for example, if they have friends who are gay, it doesn't mean that you can't have friends that are gay, but it means that you don't have to not even accept, but to exactly, right? So you can disagree on that. I was just talking about that with my wife the other day. She has some friends who are gay, but she doesn't approve of their lifestyle, and she makes that clear. So her friends know, I believe this is not the right way that you should be living, but I love you and I'm still your friend. And they have come to her and told her, I appreciate the fact that you've never judged me, that you've never, told me that I'm a horrible person or told me I'm going to go to hell, But they know, she doesn't have to. They know what they're doing is wrong. But I think also the example of being there in love, show, I'm here for you. I don't agree with this, but I still love you. And that's something that's in our culture is hard, because you see all these debates and these, two sides. There's always two sides, and I think there's always that anger, and it's emotional. It's not. We're not thinking with our heads, right? We're just so angry that I have to prove you right or wrong, and you don't win anybody that way. But I think when you're able to establish a real relationship with somebody, and little by little over the course of time, I think that's more powerful than anything you can say. Because, like in this example, she could tell him, "Oh, you're a sinner. You're going to burn in hell," right? But that's not going to help him. And as soon as she says that, that relationship's going to get cut off, and then she's not going to be able to be a witness to him. So, I think that's the same for parents.
So, some parents showed their concern that they are so busy with their professional life that they neither have time for God nor for their children.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say?
I think, like for us, my wife, she does have her own business, but it's not like a full-time thing. So she's still stay-at-home mom. She's with the kids. And, as soon as we became parents, I told her, like, I don't want you to work. Because she was working when we met. I was like, I don't want you to work. You don't need to work. If I'm able to provide for the needs of the family, why do you need to work? And we reflected on that, and it's like, if we're going to have kids, why do we want to send them off to school to spend their whole days with some other strangers so that we can go work? Is you going to work as important for us, for our family, as you being here to be with the kids? And we decided, no, it's not, right? It's more important for you to be here with the kids. If, why do we want to have kids if we're never going to see them, if they're going to be out with other people all day and not be learning from us? And so that's why we decided, for example, to homeschool. It's like, that was a big thing for us. It's like we as parents, like you said, we're the first educators. Well, then why are we sending them off to somebody else to educate them, who's probably not going to educate them the way they should be educated, right? And so I think that that's something that we as parents, and not everybody's called to it. Not everybody has the ability to. In some families, like where we live, it's super expensive, so a lot of people can't afford not to work. But I think if it is possible, I think it's better. And if you look back in history, that's how it was. The family was together. You had your farm, and you took care of the land. That's where you got your food, but you worked together as a family, and so the family was always together. And even school, what you learned just living in the day to day, and that's something that we've started to see through homeschooling, that we want to be able to provide that to our kids, to show them, when the first thing dad does when he wakes up in the morning, he goes and he prays. Teach them how to live life, not just math, science, English, right? I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think we already touched on this particular point. As I told you, the plight of Catholic faithful, most of them are poorly catechized. So, a lot of times when children come to them, they are not able to give the right answers to the very difficult and complicated questions. So, what can parents do to kind of educate them in the teachings of the church?
Read the catechism. That's a easy one. Yeah, but I think it's true, and that's why when we were teaching catechism, we said, you know what, leave the kids at home, and parents, you come to the classes. Because if the parents, like you said, if the parents don't have the answer, or if they don't even have any competency in these issues, then they do need to go to somebody else to find those answers. But a lot of times they're not going to go to the church for the answers. They're going to go to the world for the answers, and that's where problems happen. So I think something that we struggle with in the church in general is adult faith formation. Our focus is always on the kids, which is important, but if we put more of that energy into the adults so that they could catechize their own children, I think it would work much better. And that's what we saw with Family Catechism, is in bringing the parents to a deeper understanding of their faith. They're able to share that with their kids, through not through osmosis, but in a more organic way. Because I think when the kids are coming themselves, like I said, they're going to learn something, and then they're going to go home and see something else, and it's two different things. You're trying to teach them two different things at the same time. Whereas with the parents, if they're growing at a deeper level in their faith, well, they're going to naturally model for their kids what that looks like. And when it's for most people, what happens is after confirmation, you never see them again. So the understanding of and everything that they understand about God is still at a child's level, but that's dangerous, right? Your view of God needs to be growing and maturing as you go, not staying constant, because that shows that you have no relationship with God, right? It's something, any relationship is going to grow and deepen over the years, and if they don't continue to grow in their faith, then what are they going to be sharing with their kids?
Yeah, as you said, Ricky, marriage is a very difficult thing, and there are times when the husband and wife have different issues, misunderstandings. So those kind of periods is very, very important for the child, because the child is still watching how they deal with those problems. So what advice would you give for couples who are going through that misunderstanding or some conflict or friction, and but still have to take care of their children?
Yeah, and in Pope John Paul II's letters to the families, he talked about that. The family is where it's the first school for the children, whether for faith or life in general, right? And I think that's where you model for kids, what does forgiveness look like, right? Because you, as husband and wife, you're gonna have issues that require that. Well, how do we model for the kids that this is the proper way to deal with that, right? We're not just gonna yell and scream at each other, right? That doesn't accomplish anything. But if we're able to say, you know what, like for me as a man, to tell my wife, you know what, I was wrong. And I say, I'm sorry that I did whatever it was, right? For me to show my kids that, well, that's gonna leave a lasting impression on them for their life, so that when they get married or when they have friends that they disagree with, they'll be able to get past their issues. And I think that's something it's very important for the family to be able to do that. And even at a young age, because I've seen with my kids, like I said, they're 3 and 4 years old, and as hard as you try to, like I said, to teach them certain things, they see the way you live life, and they'll say, "Oh, but Daddy, what about this and that?" And you're like, "Oh yeah." And so I think, again, it goes back to what I said earlier, when I was talking about Pope John Paul II, that our example speaks much more loudly to our kids than anything that we could tell them. So I think for parents or spouses who are struggling with issues, you gotta be able to deal with those issues. And of course, like you said, Fulton Sheen says it's 3 to get married. It's not just, you don't have to depend just on yourself, and that's something that I don't think people understand that. And like in my family, I'm a child of divorce, right? So my parents are divorced and remarried. I have aunts and uncles who are divorced and remarried. My grandparents are divorced and remarried. So my whole family, if I look back, the past 2 generations, everyone is divorced and remarried. In my case, we're married in the church. We have something that none of those people had when they got married, and that's grace, because they didn't get married in the church. They got married civilly. Well, if you get married civilly, you don't get all the grace that you need to be able to deal with those struggles. I think people don't understand. They think we just get married in church because it looks good and there's pretty pictures inside of the building. Well, that's not why we get married in the church. We get married in the church because God is a part of that marriage. He's giving us, equipping us with everything that we need to be able to deal with those difficulties. Because the difficulties are going to come no matter what. Even if you get married in the church, you're still going to have fights and problems and things to deal with. But you're also going to have the tools necessary to be able to combat that. God's grace is what makes marriage possible, because, again, Pope John Paul II says, and I've been reading Family Consortio, and he talks about that a lot, It's the grace of God, it's God that makes marriage possible. We wouldn't be able to love unconditionally if it wasn't for God, right? So why would we not go to God for what we need in order to do that? And I think as husband and wife, if you're not turning to God, if you're not praying for your spouse, not just for God to change them, but for God to change you so that they can see the change in you, I think that's the source of. Jesus is the answer to everything, right? You've seen those memes where like the kid will write on his homework, Jesus is the answer to everything, and the teacher's like, well, I don't know. It's true, for all these issues that we have, if we just turn to God and say, how do we deal with this? It's a huge help.
Yeah. My last question, Ricky. As you said, you didn't have a good family to grow up your childhood. So now, seeing your children, they have a good set of parents. So do you ever feel jealous that they are given what you did not receive?
Not jealous, actually. I feel like it's a blessing for them, because they say, like, every child deserves to have a mother and a father. And like in my case, I had a father, but he was in jail, or he had another family. I didn't really know my dad until I was like in high school. So and I never really thought that was a bad thing. I was like, oh, well, I turned out okay. But now looking back and being a father myself, I'm like, man, I wish I would have had a father. I wish I would have had someone to show me what it means to be a man, right? Someone to model for me with my mom, this is what love looks like, right? I didn't have any of those things. My mom was a great example to me. She sacrificed, she worked hard for me and my brother, and I appreciate that. But I see now the value that 2 parents in the household has, and in these days that's rare, right? A lot of the kids, their families are broken homes, so it's like, what do we can't really hold them at fault for all these problems, because look at the families that they're coming out of. They have no example.
It's like
really
a vicious
tough.
circle. It kind of
Exactly.
breeds to generation.
Exactly, and it's one of the primary causes of so many of the issues that we deal with in our society right now, is that there is no home, because the home is where is our first school, like I said. So if we don't have a strong family, well, of course we're not going to learn all the necessary things that we need to be part of the world.
Yeah. So Ricky, I cannot thank you enough for taking your time to share, especially on this important institution which is kind of degrading in our today's culture, which is marriage,
For having me.
and also with also parenting, where it is so essential that parents understand their responsibility towards their children, and in turn towards God. So thank you for taking your time, Ricky. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.